Think of a nurse. Now imagine her not in a hospital, but in a concentration camp. The stench of burning flesh thick in the air, clipboard in hand, she marks names, not for treatment, but for execution. This was not a nightmare, but reality in Nazi Germany. And when the Third Reich crumbled in 1945, these nurses vanished into the ruins. Unlike the infamous SS doctors who stood in the glare of war crimes tribunals, many of these women, trained in healing, escaped scrutiny altogether. Yet they played pivotal roles in some of the regime's darkest medical programs: forced sterilizations, euthanasia of the disabled, and selections at camps like Ravensbrück. What happened to them after the war? Did justice find them, or did history forget them? This video ventures into the unsettling silence that followed their footsteps, tracing trials, evasions, and the enduring ethical stain left by the nurses of the Nazi regime. Before the swastika draped Germany in ideological shadow, nursing was viewed as a vocation of compassion and care. But with Hitler's rise in 1933, this image warped. The profession was systematically politicized, militarized, and absorbed into the Nazi vision of racial purity. Nurses were no longer just caregivers. They became instruments of the state's eugenic ambitions. Under the banner of racial hygiene, thousands of nurses were mobilized to enforce policies aimed at cleansing the German gene pool. They assisted doctors in sterilization procedures of those labeled hereditarily unfit, schizophrenics, epileptics, and others with disabilities. In institutions and asylums, nurses administered lethal overdoses to children under the Kindereuthanasie program, often by mixing sedatives into their food or injections. Training was also transformed. Nursing schools indoctrinated students with Nazi ideology, emphasizing obedience, loyalty to the Führer, and the supremacy of Aryan health. Many joined the National Socialist Nurses Association, pledging service not to individuals, but to the folk. This ideological shift laid the groundwork for the atrocities that would follow. Nurses, cloaked in the respectability of their white uniforms, became gatekeepers of life and death. They operated not just in hospitals, but in killing centers and concentration camps, wielding stethoscopes in one hand and syringes of poison in the other. It was this deeply corrupted version of medical care that set the stage for the horrors committed by medical personnel, including women once entrusted to heal. Nowhere was the perversion of nursing more pronounced than in the concentration camps, grim theaters where medical ethics were contorted into instruments of torture. Among these, Ravensbrück stands out. As the largest Nazi camp for women, it was not only a site of forced labor and execution, but also a hub for medical experimentation, carried out under the watchful eyes of female nurses. Ravensbrück housed over 130,000 women, many subjected to brutal surgeries without anesthesia. Polish political prisoners, known as the rabbits, were experimented on with bone transplants, gangrene induction, and sulfonamide drug testing. While male SS doctors performed the operations, it was often the nurses who prepped the victims, administered follow-up care, or left them to rot. Their involvement was hands-on, not peripheral. Elizabeth Marshall, the chief nurse at Ravensbrück, became a rare exception to the post-war silence. Known as the Angel of Death, she was accused of overseeing selections for gas chambers, administering lethal injections, and refusing treatment to dying inmates. In 1947, she stood trial at Hamburg and was sentenced to death. She was hanged the same year, yet Marshall's case was the exception, not the rule. Dozens of nurses worked in camps like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Majdanek, participating in mass murder through neglect, forced experimentation, and so-called euthanasia. Few were ever named, few were still prosecuted. Their white uniforms offered not only a symbol of purity, but a cloak of impunity. And when the gates of the camps swung open in 1945, most simply walked away, disappearing into a war-torn Germany desperate to forget. When the Third Reich collapsed, the Allies launched a historic legal reckoning. The Nuremberg trials are remembered for bringing Nazi leaders and physicians to justice. But beneath the headlines, the role of nurses was largely ignored. Though a few faced prosecution, most returned quietly to civilian life. The British-led Hamburg Ravensbrück trials in 1946-47 were a rare moment when female medical personnel were held to account. Alongside Elizabeth Marshall, several camp nurses were charged with crimes against humanity. The tribunal heard testimonies of patients injected with phenol, denied basic care, and left to suffer under orders. While some nurses received death or prison sentences, the number was vanishingly small compared to the scope of involvement. A grim statistic reveals the depth of this impunity. Over 100,000 German nurses were estimated to have worked during the Nazi era. Only a handful were ever tried. Why? Partly because nurses were seen as subordinate, mere assistants to male doctors. Post-war narratives cast women primarily as victims of war, of propaganda, of circumstance. Gendered assumptions shielded many from deeper scrutiny. Add to this a society eager to rebuild and forget, and you get a recipe for silence. Moreover, many of these women proved useful in the post-war medical shortage. Some resumed nursing, others entered domestic life. Few confessed, and fewer were asked. The 1950s and 60s brought little appetite for revisiting these histories. Amnesty laws, lenient sentencing, and early releases allowed convicted personnel to reintegrate. Some, like those involved in child euthanasia programs, even returned to pediatric wards. The failure to fully prosecute Nazi nurses reflects broader failures in post-war justice, failures that left moral scars as enduring as the physical ones borne by survivors. The white coats were not burned. They were simply washed, folded, and worn again. When the last camp gates were opened and the smoke of war cleared, the fate of Nazi nurses dissolved into a disturbing silence. The world focused on generals, SS officers, and male physicians, while the women who had staffed the wards, wielded syringes, and administered state-sanctioned death largely vanished into obscurity. In reality, most of these nurses resumed civilian lives with shocking ease. Some quietly reintegrated into the post-war healthcare system, taking up positions in hospitals and clinics now operating under Allied supervision. Others retreated into domesticity, their wartime roles never scrutinized. A few changed names, towns, or professions. The chaos of a shattered Europe made it easy to disappear. This vanishing act was not only social, but institutional. In the effort to rebuild, Germany, and much of Europe, chose pragmatism over justice. There were dire shortages of medical staff, and authorities often prioritized experience over moral vetting. Former Nazi nurses were hired back into practice, their pasts ignored, or worse, justified. The narrative of the obedient nurse, merely following orders, became the shield behind which many hid. Even within the nursing profession itself, reckoning was delayed for decades. Nursing associations and educational institutions were slow to acknowledge their members' roles in the atrocities. The profession, built on a self-image of compassion and healing, resisted confronting its complicity in genocide and forced sterilization. It wasn't until the late 20th century that serious academic and legal attention began peeling back this layer of denial. Researchers uncovered staff lists, trial records, and testimonies buried in archives. Survivors who had been cared for or tortured by these women finally began to speak. Some ethics curricula in German nursing schools now include modules on these wartime crimes. But for most of the perpetrators, these revelations came too late. They died untried, unrepentant, and largely unknown. The afterlives of Nazi nurses exposed the limits of justice and the cost of forgetting. Their white uniforms, once soaked in blood, were never displayed in courtrooms or museums. They were folded away, and their stories hidden in drawers no one wanted to open. The story of the Nazi nurses is not merely a footnote to the horrors of the Holocaust. It is a case study in complicity hidden in plain sight. These were not faceless bureaucrats or distant commanders. They were trained caregivers, many of them women, entrusted with preserving life. Instead, they became instruments of a regime that redefined care as control and healing as annihilation. The few who faced trial, like Elizabeth Marshall, serve as reminders of what justice might have looked like had it been fully pursued. But for the vast majority, there were no indictments, no interrogations, no reckonings, just silence. They returned to ordinary lives, carried on with ordinary routines in a world eager to forget their extraordinary crimes. What does this legacy say about justice, about memory, about the ethics of caregiving under authoritarian rule? Even today, the nursing profession grapples with this shadow. While some institutions now include Holocaust education and ethical reflection in their training, Others still struggle to confront the profession's past. And as survivors pass away and archives close or decay, the opportunity for full accountability slips further from reach. In confronting the fates of Nazi nurses, we are forced to confront broader truths: how societies remember, how gender can shield guilt, and how systems of care can be bent toward cruelty. So perhaps the real question isn't what became of them, but how many more like them walked away, unnoticed, and never looked back.